Gather round, my friends, as I share a tale that has haunted me through countless storms. Picture me here in my little wooden cabin high in the mountains, the rain drumming a relentless beat on the roof and the fireplace crackling its warm, dancing light as I recount this dark chapter of my life. It began when the owner of our building had already given me a stern warning. I knew that if I couldn't pay the rent by the end of the month, we'd have to shut the doors for good. But what tormented me far more was the constant sting of failure, a feeling that had shadowed my life. I'd once believed that if I did everything right, God would provide. Yet now, as my church crumbled before my very eyes, all my prayers, sermons, and fasts seemed to fall on deaf ears. Then, out of the blue, an old acquaintance reappeared, a pastor whom I had admired many years ago, though time had changed him into someone entirely different. He now led a massive congregation, one that was growing like wildfire. I'd seen him on television, always surrounded by devoted believers, tears streaming down their faces as they testified to extraordinary miracles. Yet, with a wry half-smile, he confided to me, "I see your church is nearly empty. I know. People don't want just words. They want to see God in action." There was something in his tone that troubled me, but I was desperate for help, and he seemed to know exactly what to do. He pressed a scrap of paper into my hand with an address scribbled on it. "Go to this place," he said. "There. You'll find someone who can help you change your fate, but come with an open mind." I hesitated at first. Something inside warned me that it might not be right, but the other part of me, exhausted from preaching to empty pews, shouted that I could not let this chance slip away. That very night, after my wife and children had drifted off to sleep, I took my car and drove to the address. The place was an old temple, seemingly abandoned. Inside, the air was heavy, as if the very darkness had seeped into the walls. Out of the murky shadows, a voice called, "You have come because you are in need, and I can give you what you seek." I should have left then, but I stayed. That day marked the turning point of my life. I don't recall uttering the word yes. Perhaps I merely fell silent for too long, or maybe it was my heavy breathing, my restless gaze, or the inner battle between my mind and my conscience. Somehow the entity sensed that I was ready. It requested something simple, or so I was told that night. "Allow me to be present at your services. I will open your congregation's eyes to the supernatural, and they will come. They will believe." As I left that place, a heavy weight seemed to settle upon me, and the very air around me grew denser. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had transpired. Perhaps I was simply overreacting, or maybe God was testing me by presenting a choice. Yet, I did not look back. The following Sunday, something unusual occurred. The church wasn't yet full, but there were more people than usual. Perhaps word of mouth was working, or perhaps the curious were drawn to the promise of change. I began my sermon as always, but halfway through, I heard a piercing cry. A woman seated in the third row collapsed, trembling uncontrollably. Her breath became ragged, and her body convulsed in a most unnerving manner. Others around her started to pray, trying to drive away whatever it was that possessed her. Then, one person after another began to scream. There was something different in the way it all unfolded. It wasn't like the fervent manifestations of Pentecostal services I'd witnessed before. This was deeper, more primal. I recall looking into the eyes of a man who seemed possessed, and those eyes were not his own. Yet the most terrifying part wasn't what had happened in the sanctuary, it was what came afterward. People left that service declaring they had never felt anything like it. The presence of God had manifested with a force unlike any before. They wept and thanked the heavens, certain that they were finally on the right path. The very next Sunday, my church was full, and the one after that, even fuller. I should have felt fear, should have halted the proceedings, but the power was intoxicating. After that service, everything changed. Empty pews vanished. On the next Sunday, every bench was occupied by newcomers. Folks who'd never set foot in my church sought me out, whispering that they'd heard of the miracles and wanted to experience God's power for themselves. The tithes surged, easing my worries about overdue rent, electricity bills, or my employees' salaries. Instead, my thoughts turned to expanding the church. A new sound system, cushioned pews, maybe even a program on the local radio. All seemed to be on the right track. But then whispers began. At first, they were isolated accounts. A lady approached me after a service, hesitantly saying, "Pastor, I feel something strange inside the church. I thought I heard someone calling me when I arrived, but there was no one there." I too recalled the first time I set foot in that building as a boy, a memory etched like an invisible scar. I remembered my mother's firm grip on my hand as she led me through dark wooden pews, the mingling scents of candle wax and perfumed ladies calming my young soul. What struck me most that night was the music. The choir sang a hymn from the old hymn book, their voices blending into a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. I couldn't fully comprehend the lyrics, but I felt something strong and genuine within them, as if those songs were alive, carrying an energy beyond mere sound. I grew up in that sacred atmosphere, surrounded by vigils, prayer meetings, and heartfelt gatherings. The church wasn't just a place to ask for blessings, it was a refuge. Families helped one another without expecting anything in return, and men and women wept, not out of despair, but from feeling something greater than themselves. From an early age, I knew what I wanted for my life. I wanted to be a pastor, to stand at the pulpit guiding people just as the pastors I admired once did. I longed to speak of God, love, and salvation. To let others experience that same peace I felt when the hymns played. It wasn't a fleeting desire. My faith only grew stronger as I spent hours studying the Bible and the sermons of great preachers. When asked what I aspired to be, my answer was always the same: a man of God. I believed that if I dedicated myself truly, my path would remain straight and true, and that faith and hard work would be enough to build a strong church of sincere souls. Yet I had no inkling of what awaited me, of how the faith of people had shifted, or that the church I dreamed of constructing was not the one they wished to attend. Looking back, I see how naive I was. I once believed that serving God was simply about devotion and surrender, but over time I would learn there was something more, something no one had ever told me during my formative years. I was just a young man full of dreams, unaware that I was about to embark on a journey from which there would be no return. The first time I took the pulpit as the head pastor, a chill unlike any I'd felt before gripped me. That night, the church was packed. Old, loyal members who'd known my story since childhood, and curious visitors drawn by the promise of a new beginning. I felt fulfilled. At last, my calling was being realized. In the early months, I maintained a steady pace, preaching compassion, singing hymns that touched the heart, and striving to bring the pure essence of my childhood church to that place. But gradually, something unsettling began to occur. On Sundays, as I surveyed the congregation, I noticed empty pews where whole families once sat. Some long-time members simply stopped coming. At first, I dismissed it as mere coincidence. Perhaps they were traveling or simply busy, but as the months dragged on, the attendance dwindled further. I spoke with some of the elder congregants, and their responses were always the same. "Pastor, your sermons are beautiful, but people want to see God in action. They want miracles, signs, and healings. If they don't witness that, they'll go elsewhere." That struck me more deeply than I care to admit. I had believed that God's word was enough, that pure teaching was more important than any spectacle, but for many that was no longer sufficient. It wasn't long before the consequences began to manifest. With fewer believers, the tithes dropped, the church bills began piling up, and the rent for the building fell behind. I knew that if nothing changed, we would be forced to close our doors. One night, as I pored over my sermon with a furrowed brow, my wife sat beside me and softly said, "Perhaps you should reconsider your approach. I see other pastors, other churches growing. Maybe you need to adapt." The word adapt echoed in my mind. But what did that truly mean? To change the message? To promise blessings I knew I couldn't guarantee? I was there to teach the truth, not to peddle illusions. Yet with every Sunday that passed, another pew sat empty, and I realized that if I continued as I had, soon there'd be no one left to preach to. I tried to remain calm, but the truth was, I was desperate. The bills kept coming, and what I first dismissed as the emotional high of intense services was becoming something far more sinister. One evening, as I reviewed my sermon in the empty church office, I sensed something odd. The hall was dark and silent. No lights, no soul in sight, but there was a distant murmur, as if dozens of voices were softly praying. When I went out to investigate, I found no one there, yet the pews creaked as if someone had just risen from them. Then came the eyes. During a service that was as packed as ever, while I was preaching, something in the crowd made me lose my train of thought. In the back row, a man stood motionless, his gaze piercing me like a cold blade. He didn't blink. His eyes looked inhuman. And then, as if he were a phantom, he vanished. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was mere exhaustion or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew. I was no longer in control. I should have foreseen that nothing would come without a price. Up to that moment, all the entity had asked was for me to open the doors to its presence during services, and I had complied. The manifestations grew ever more intense. People fainting, screaming, speaking in strange tongues. The church had never been so full. But then, one night, the entity visited me again. I wasn't asleep. I was in my office, poring over the church's figures and contemplating new ways to expand our reach. The night was warm until suddenly the air turned icy, as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. I felt a presence behind me, yet I did not turn around. I knew who it was. "You must go further," the voice commanded. Not in a single tone, but as if many voices spoke at once, some whispering, others shouting. My entire body froze. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, striving to keep my composure. "Spread my mark," the entity ordered. It instructed me to bring blessed objects to the church, earth from Jerusalem, sacred water, items that the faithful would take home, believing they were protected. But in truth, these objects were imbued with something otherworldly, something that did not belong to this world. At first I resisted, but the entity did not take kindly to my hesitation. The air grew oppressive, and a deafening noise overwhelmed my mind. I felt as if an unseen force was crushing me. "You have made a pact. Now fulfill your part," it thundered. I yielded, not out of desire, but because I felt I had no choice. The following week the objects were distributed. The faithful received them with gratitude, unaware of the dark cargo they carried. It wasn't until later that the reports began to surface. A woman came to me in despair, saying, "Pastor, something is wrong. Since I brought the water home, I hear voices in the night. My son claims he sees a man standing in the corner of his room, staring at him while he sleeps." She wasn't alone. Others recounted objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut and shadows roaming the rooms. But by then it was too late. The pact had been sealed, and the evil was no longer confined within the church walls. It had spread. I had believed I could control it, that by following the instructions everything would continue smoothly. Yet, as is often the case, there was always someone who could see beyond the veil. Deacon Jose was one such man, a long-time honest and faithful member of the church who, unlike the others, never succumbed to the trance during services. He simply watched, unblinking. One night he knocked on my office door. "May I speak with you, Pastor?" he said, his tone grave and laden with something I dreaded to hear. He sat down, folded his hands, and took a deep breath before speaking. Something is terribly wrong. I have served God for decades. I have witnessed the mighty workings of the Holy Spirit, miracles, healings. But what is happening here is not of God. For a moment I almost laughed. I wanted to call him an old, paranoid man, but his expression was far too serious. He knew, and I knew he was right. "You don't understand, Jose," I tried to argue. "We are growing. We are reaching more souls than ever before. What matters is that people are coming to God." He simply shook his head. "People aren't coming to God. They are coming for whatever is lurking within these walls." His gaze pierced me, and I felt suddenly insignificant. Then he added in a voice that chilled me to the bone, "I will seek the truth. If there is something evil here, I must expose it." That very night, the entity visited me again. It didn't need words. I already knew what had to be done. The next morning, Jose did not appear for the service, nor did he return in the weeks that followed. No one dared ask what became of him. After Jose's disappearance, something within me shattered. I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. The services were still full, the tithes hitting record highs, and the church growing faster than I could manage. Yet unlike before, I no longer felt satisfaction. Each time I stepped up to the pulpit, I felt a crushing weight on my shoulders, as if an unseen force was draining my very essence. The words I spoke rang hollow, as though I had lost control of them. And then the nightmares began. In the first dream, I was preaching to a congregation whose faces were nothing more than empty voids, dark hollows where eyes should have been. I tried to speak, but my voice echoed strangely, as if coming from someone else. In the second, I found myself alone at the altar, the church hall empty save for disembodied whispers and the sensation of something moving among the pews, though I could see nothing. And on the third night, I saw Jose standing at the church door, his gaze fixed upon me, but his eyes were wrong. They were the same inhuman eyes I had seen in that last row. I awoke in a cold sweat, my body trembling, realizing I could not go on any longer. I made the painful decision to step away. I entrusted the services to other pastors, delegated responsibilities, and attempted to vanish slowly into the background. But the entity would not let me go. That fateful night, I returned to the church to gather a few personal belongings. The sanctuary was dark and silent, but as I passed the pews, I felt a chill brush against my skin, as if invisible fingers had caressed me. Then I heard that familiar voice. "You think you can leave?" My heart pounded wildly. "You think it ends when you choose to walk away? You will always belong to me." I sensed a presence so overpowering behind me that my entire body stiffened. I knew with a sinking certainty that I was bound to it forever. That night, sleep eluded me. Ever since what had occurred in the church, my body refused to relax. My eyes grew heavy, yet every time I closed them, I heard whispers in the dark. Then at 3 a.m, my room turned unnaturally cold. Not the typical chill of early dawn, but a deep, bone-penetrating cold that weighed upon my soul. I didn't need to open my eyes to know it was there. A strange smell, reminiscent of burnt meat and rusty metal, filled the air. My body froze as though unseen hands held me down on the mattress. And then came the voice once more. "You still do not understand. This was never about the church, never about miracles or faith. The air around you vibrates with a power far greater than yourself. You desired power, and I granted it. You longed for a full church, and I gave you a multitude. Now you must pay the price." My mouth tried to form words, but nothing emerged. "You belong to me, now and forever." I felt something touch my forehead, not a hand, but an invisible weight, as if something were marking my very soul. I screamed, but no sound came out. My wife slept by my side that night, as serene as ever, as if nothing had happened. But I knew in my heart that I no longer needed the church to keep the pact. The pact was now with me, and deep down I understood that no matter what I did or where I went, it would never let me go. Time passed. The church still stands, services remain full, people still fall, tremble, weep, and shout, believing they are receiving something divine. But I know the truth. I no longer preach. I have passed the mantle on to others. Now, I am merely a man who watches it all unfold, knowing that none of it truly belongs to God. I know what lies behind each miracle, who truly collects the offerings and to whom the prayers are directed, even if no one in that congregation realizes it. And the worst of all is this: I cannot escape. I once believed I could run, that if I walked away, it would all end. But it never does. It's always there, in the mirror's reflection, in the dark corner of the room when the light goes out, in every nightmare that haunts my sleep. Sometimes I wonder, in the midst of it all, if I ever truly saved anyone. Did even one soul, despite all my lies and the horror I unleashed, find true faith? I shall never know. What I do know is that my soul is long condemned. And if you are listening to this tale, heed my warning. Not every church is what it seems, and not every miracle comes from God. Remember, the evil is never far behind. It always finds its way back home. Now, my friends, as the rain continues its relentless song against these old wooden walls and the fire crackles softly, remember this: keep your eyes open and never let the darkness fool you.